At the beginning of the 13th century, thousands of children set out on the roads of Europe. Without weapons, without maps, without protection. They were going to Jerusalem to liberate the Holy Sepulchre. They were led by boy prophets who said that the sea would part before them, as it had before Moses. Some considered them saints. Others considered them madmen. They disappeared. Some ended up in slavery, others in legend. What was it? Naive faith? Mass hysteria? Or one of the most terrifying myths of the Middle Ages, which people preferred to forget? Now, we will tell you the truth. At the beginning of the 13th century, Europe was in a strange and unsettling state of equilibrium. These were the final years of the so-called era of the Crusades, a time when the entire Western Christian world lived in anticipation of miracles and fear. More than a century had passed since the First Crusade brought knights to the walls of Jerusalem. The Holy Sepulchre had been captured, and the blood of Muslims, Jews, and even Christians had been shed in the name of saving souls. But the further it went, the more this sacred undertaking turned into a series of failures, defeats, and scandals. By the beginning of the 13th century, the spirit of those first crusades had already faded. The Fourth Crusade ended in disgrace. The Crusaders did not reach the Holy Land, but plundered the Christian city of Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The idea of the Crusades, the idea of redemption, salvation, and holy struggle, began to decay. But the people, especially the poor, still longed to participate in the great mission. Preachers went from town to town, telling of miracles, visions, and the need for new sacrifices. In the streets, the sermons took on an almost hysterical character. Many believed that the end of the world was near. Revelations, hallucinations, and mass religious psychosis were all part of the cultural and spiritual environment of the time. Children were especially susceptible to this. In schools and monasteries, they were told how Christ suffered for sinners, how Jerusalem was the center of the world, and how sinful the adult world had become. The children listened, absorbed, and at some point believed that they could become the ones who would change everything. That it was not knights, but they, pure and untainted, who were capable of liberating the Holy Land. They had no swords, no money, no political interests, only faith and songs. It was believed that it was thanks to this faith that the sea would part, as in the biblical story of Moses, and they would reach Jerusalem. It was a world where the line between the mystical and the real was almost blurred. A vision could become action, and a rumor could become a collective obsession. In this strange, tense, pre-apocalyptic atmosphere, one of the most tragic and controversial stories of the Middle Ages was born. The story of the Children's Crusade. In the spring of 1152, a boy named Stephen appeared on the streets of the French town of Clou. According to some sources, he was about 12 years old, according to others, a little older. Outwardly, he was no different from other peasant children, poor, barefoot, sunburnt. But it was he who became the center of one of the most mysterious stories of the Middle Ages. Stephen claimed that Christ himself had appeared to him, not in a dream or in prayer, but physically, on the road. According to the boy, the Lord gave him a letter for the French King Philip II and ordered him to lead a campaign that would liberate the Holy Land without weapons or blood. This was not just a vision, it was a mission. He assured everyone that God had entrusted him with gathering an army of children, for only the pure could return the Holy Sepulchre. This statement was not taken as delusion, but as a sign. In an era when revelations were considered reality and miracles were an expected part of life, The boy prophet instantly became famous. Crowds flocked to him. He preached in the squares, sang psalms, and spoke with the confidence of an adult prophet. He was compared to Moses, and some even to the baby Jesus. At first, parents tried to take their children home, but very quickly, they themselves began to see something special in him. Stephen declared that the sea would part before them, and they would walk to Jerusalem. He said that the Saracens would not stop them, that the Lord would lead them. In a matter of weeks, according to various sources, between 3,000 and 30,000 children followed him. They ranged in age from 8 to 16. They walked barefoot, carrying wooden crosses and singing hymns. They were joined by beggars, outcasts, and even a few monks. No one knew exactly where they were going, but it didn't matter. The main thing was to keep going. Almost at the same time, in the Holy Roman Empire, in the city of Cologne, a second leader appeared, a boy named Nicola. His story was almost identical. Nicola also claimed to have heard the voice of God. He began his journey across the Alps, moving south toward the Italian ports, from where the children were supposed to sail to Palestine. According to chroniclers, his army was just as numerous. Some sources write of 7,000 children, others of 20,000. Nicholas was not just an inspirer. According to recollections, he organized columns, established a schedule for the march, and arranged for lodging. Some monks saw him as a new apostle. People gave them bread, water, and opened the doors of monasteries. Some bishops tried to stop the movement, but they were powerless. Who would go against children led by God? There are theories that adults may have been behind the two boys, preachers, perhaps even radical monks or political figures who wanted to create a new wave of religious revival. However, none of these assumptions have clear evidence. The sources speak specifically of a children's initiative, a spontaneous movement. It is interesting that the Church initially reacted to these events with restraint. Pope Innocent III did not bless the march, but he did not condemn it publicly either. Some monks saw it as a divine sign, others as heresy. The story of children going to liberate Jerusalem without swords was too inconvenient. It exposed the hypocrisy of adult religious politics. So, two streams of children, one from France, the other from Germany, began to move south. They walked in different directions, but with the same goal: to reach the Holy Land and return it to God. They had no weapons, no training, no maps. Only the voice of the prophet, and a faith that in those days seemed stronger than reality. When Stephen of Cluny left his city, about 300 children followed him. Within a few days, there were several thousand. The Children's Crusade was rapidly turning into a growing avalanche. The children walked barefoot, in worn-out clothes, carrying homemade crosses and icons. They sang psalms, cried out to heaven, and prayed at every stop. The procession moved along the roads of France, and each new town added dozens, sometimes hundreds, of new participants. The chronicler Jean de Malter wrote that when the procession passed through large cities, wives and men came out into the streets and wept as they watched the columns of infants marching to liberate the Holy Land. In some places, they were applauded and given bread and water. In others, they tried to disperse them, fearing heresy, but the flow could not be stopped. As they moved along, a kind of children's society formed, spontaneous communities with a division of roles. The older ones led the columns, the younger ones prayed. They had their own singers and their own holy banners. All this happened without any centralized control. No king or bishop officially approved the movement. And yet, the children kept going. Inspired by Stephen's speeches, they believed that God would send them a miracle. Stephen himself repeated that the sea would part before them. This idea spread among them like wildfire. They told each other stories about how angels would accompany them. Some said they saw stars forming a cross in the sky. Their collective belief created its own reality. The adult world no longer had any power over them. Some children died along the way. The French summer was hot, and food quickly ran out. Those who remained continued on. They walked for weeks. The people they met along the way couldn't understand what was happening. Was it heresy? Mass madness? Or perhaps the Second Coming? Meanwhile, in the north, in the Holy Roman Empire, Nicola led his column across the Alps. It was a much more difficult journey, but the children followed him as if he were their leader. They crossed mountain passes, slept under the open sky, ate tree bark, and drank from glacial rivers, all for the sake of their faith. According to descriptions, Nicola was quiet and confident. He did not speak loudly, but people listened to him. Some nuns called him the Christ child. In Italy, children were treated with suspicion. Some were taken in, especially in monasteries. But the closer they got to the coast, the more uneasy the city authorities became. Children without parents, dirty, hungry, with fanatical looks. They looked like a threat to public order. Several cities tried to ban them from entering. Some were beaten. Some were dispersed. But the army of faith marched on. The ships that, according to legend, were supposed to be waiting for them did not appear. The children reached the ports in Marseille, Genoa, Pisa, and saw only water. The sea did not part. The ships were not waiting. The pilgrimage was coming to an end. Some chronicles say that adults began to use children for their own purposes. Merchants, ship owners, and unknown figures began to promise them help, ships, and provisions. But what happened next would become one of the most terrible chapters in this story. But for now, the children walked on. They still believed. They still hoped. They sang. They walked barefoot on stones and hot dust. They did not yet know that many of them would never return home. And perhaps they would never see the land their bare, bloodied feet had trodden on again. The path the children walked was not just physical. It became a road between worlds, between faith and death, between mysticism and reality. Thousands of boys and girls, inspired by the prophecies of Stephen and Nicola, moved toward the sea, hoping to reach Jerusalem. But this road quickly became their cross to bear. In the most literal sense, they walked for weeks, some for months. Food was scarce, and water quickly became contaminated. The summer heat of the Mediterranean scorched their strength, and disease spread among the children like wildfire. Bodies littered the roads, victims of dehydration, exhaustion, and wounds sustained along the way. No one buried the dead according to custom. They were buried in roadside pits or left to be devoured by wolves. But despite all this, the children continued on, because miracles were happening along the way. The chronicles report that once a column led by Stephen approached a village where all the inhabitants were deaf. After the children prayed, some of the deaf, allegedly, regained their hearing. Elsewhere, according to legend, a blind woman saw the light and exclaimed that the archangel Michael himself had passed before her. One of the boys, named Jean, claimed that at night a white dove hovered over the camp, speaking in Latin. Only those who were fasting could hear it. For the children themselves, These events were proof that God was with them. But for observers, especially representatives of the church, what was happening increasingly resembled possession, or worse, heresy. Some bishops called for an end to the movement, calling it a satanic imitation of the true faith. However, the people, especially the common folk, continued to feed the children and sometimes even gave them their own children. One of the girls, Louise, is said to have predicted the death of the abbess of a convent, who indeed died 3 days later. Some chroniclers claim that the children began to have dreams full of fire and blood, in which they fought against evil spirits. Modern psychologists would call this a collective trance, induced by stress and religious excitement. But back then, it was a miracle. There were also horrors. Several groups of children were robbed. Some girls were raped by vagrants and mercenaries. Sometimes adult criminals hiding from the law followed the column, taking advantage of the chaos. Sometimes they were attacked by peasants who saw the children as a gang capable of carrying away all the village's provisions. Periodically, the children took the law into their own hands. One document states that a group of children accused a boy of heresy and beat him to death. It was chaos disguised as a mission. Miracles and horrors intertwined. At every turn, faith clashed with hunger, hope with cruelty. But the movement continued. Even when bodies fell along the road, even when adults refused to believe, the children kept going. Because they believed that there would be a reward for their suffering, and that somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon, the waves would part. When the columns of children finally reached the coast, their belief in a miracle reached its peak. They arrived in Marseille, the southern port of France, and one of the largest trading hubs in the Mediterranean. Stephen said that the sea would part as it had for Moses, but the water remained motionless. It lapped in time with the waves and remained silent. The children stood on the shore for several days. They sang, prayed, and cried. But no miracle happened. Then, according to legend, 2 merchants appeared. According to various chronicles, they were called Hugo Iron and William the Holy. They were among those who often appeared in such places, fabulously wealthy, with ships and a good reputation. They said they were willing to provide the children with 7 ships to take them to the Holy Land, free of charge, in the name of the Lord. These men were welcomed as angels. Stephen and his companions believed them. Soon, thousands of children boarded the ships, which set sail from the coast of Marseille. According to some sources, there were about 5,000 of them. According to others, up to 7,000. Parents who found their children on the coast saw them off in tears. Some felt uneasy, but the ships were already disappearing over the horizon. What happened next is shrouded in mystery. It was only several years later that the first rumors began to surface. The ships never reached the Holy Land. 2 of them, according to a monk from Levanta, sank off the coast of Sardinia during a storm. There were about 500 children on board. All of them drowned. The remaining 5 ships did not reach Palestine, but instead landed on the African coast, where the children were sold into slavery. It turned out that the merchants were not benefactors, but slave traders. The children became commodities. They were sold in the markets of Alexandria, Tunis, and Beirut. Some chronicles say that the Egyptian sultan was amazed by this gift from Christian lands. He allegedly freed some of the children, but most of them disappeared without a trace in the sands of the slave-owning East. Nicola's story developed differently, but with the same tragic ending. He reached Genoa, but there he was met with suspicion. The Genoese authorities did not allow the children to go to Palestine. Some managed to find shelter in monasteries. Others returned home. Few. Most disappeared. Some died on the way. Others vanished into poverty. According to some sources, Nicola died of illness. According to others, he lived to old age and became a monk. The chronicles of these events are confusing. Some say that the children were sold into slavery on the orders of the church. Others that it was all a mistake, and that the merchants acted on their own initiative. There is little real evidence. But one thing is clear. Thousands of children disappeared. Many of them forever. When the truth began to seep out, the church hastened to distance itself from the campaign. Pope Innocent III, who had initially remained silent, later said, "The children surpassed the adults, for they went with faith, without a sword." But no official investigation, punishment, or compensation followed. Everything was attributed to naivety, to a mistake of faith. Stephen himself, according to one version, returned to France. He was summoned for questioning at a monastery, where he was interrogated about whether he was a heretic. His subsequent fate is unknown. Some say he disappeared into the depths of the country. Others say he was quietly killed. Perhaps he died of starvation. Perhaps of despair. Thus ended the crusade that began with songs and faith. 7 ships carried thousands of children to nowhere. The sea did not part. Jerusalem remained unattainable. And faith collided with the cruel reality of human greed. Despite the fact that the story of the Children's Crusade has been passed down from generation to generation as one of the most tragic episodes of the Middle Ages, its authenticity is the subject of much debate among modern historians. The question is simple: did this crusade actually happen? At first glance, there is plenty of evidence. Medieval chronicles from the 13th and 14th centuries, including the works of Jacques de Vitry, Albert of Saint, Adalbert, Requin of Lyon, and others, mention the march of the children, their faith, and their tragic fate. These sources paint a vivid and dramatic picture. But here's the problem. These descriptions don't match up, and more importantly, they were written years, sometimes decades, after the supposed events. For example, Jacques de Vitry wrote about children inspired by a heavenly voice, but in other texts, the same kids are called beggars, wanderers, and young fanatics. Albert of Saint. Adalbert, on the contrary, considered the march a heresy and wrote about it more as a teenage rebellion. And the Chronicle of Requien mentions a certain march of young people without specifying their age, goals, or composition. Many modern researchers suggest that it may not have been about children at all, but about the poor, teenagers, and ruined peasants who united under the banner of a new religious idea. In the Middle Ages, the term pueri, Latin for boys, often referred not to age but to social status, the lowest, disenfranchised. In other words, the Children's Crusade may have actually been a march of the poor. The number of participants is also questionable. The figures in the chronicles vary from several thousand to 30,000. However, there is no trace of such a large-scale disappearance of people in state archives, tax documents, or church records. In the conditions of the 13th century, even the disappearance of 2,000 people would have left a trace in the documents. But there are none. This suggests that the chroniclers exaggerated the scale of the event or mixed several different episodes into one. The motive itself is also questionable. The idea that the sea would part before children seems like a Christianized myth, an echo of the Old Testament story of Moses. Perhaps the chroniclers consciously or subconsciously gave the events a more biblical flavor, embellishing reality. Another version is symbolic. Some historians believe that the Children's Crusade is not a historical fact, but an allegory created by the Church for edification. The story of children going to liberate Jerusalem could be a metaphor for pure faith, contrasted with the hypocrisy of the adult world. This interpretation makes the whole episode more of a legend than a chronicle. Nevertheless, it is impossible to completely deny the existence of the movement. Some documents, especially in German monasteries, confirm the appearance of large groups of young pilgrims. Perhaps it all really happened, but on a smaller scale, without miracles and tragic ships, and turned into a myth 100 years after the real events. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Perhaps the children really did go. Perhaps they were manipulated. Perhaps the chroniclers, struck by the sight of this strange army, turned a local episode into a grandiose parable. Or perhaps it was all true, and we simply refuse to believe it. Over time, the story of the Children's Crusade has almost disappeared from public memory. It did not make it into school textbooks. It is rarely discussed in Christian courses. Even in academic circles, it is remembered with caution, as something too inconvenient, too irrational. Why? Perhaps because it exposes wounds too well. It shows how faith can be turned into a weapon, how children, the most vulnerable, the purest, become carriers of ideas they cannot comprehend, and how adults, the church, merchants, politicians, either silently watch the tragedy unfold or direct it to their own advantage. The Children's Crusade has become an archetype, a symbol of pure faith, unprotected from the world, a myth about an attempt to change history without violence, and about how the world suppresses such attempts. It echoes other stories about young martyrs, teenage prophets, and naivety that turned into tragedy. It rarely appears in culture, but when it does, it is always with bitterness. Some compare it to the early Christians, others to young people who died in revolutions. It is a reminder that sometimes the brightest impulses lead to the darkest abyss. Or maybe it's all just a myth. But if so, why did we need it? Why did generations of people preserve this particular story in their memory? A story where children walked barefoot along a dusty road, carrying crosses, singing songs, and disappearing into the sea. Perhaps because even in the darkest chronicles, we want to believe that somewhere, sometime, someone really wanted to change the world. Not with a sword, but with faith. And even if they didn't make it to Jerusalem, they made it into our memories, to us.